A millionaire came to an orphanage to attend a concert of children there suddenly. He sees a face. The grand auditorium of St. Catherine's Orphanage was dimly lit, its aging wooden beams creaking faintly as guests took their seats. Soft murmurs filled the space, blending with the occasional clinking of wine glasses from the small reception area near the entrance. The scent of old paper programs and polished mahogany lingered in the air. Nathaniel Carter, a man who had built his fortune from the ground up, adjusted his cufflinks absent-mindedly as he entered the hall. He had attended countless charity events over the years, his presence more of an obligation than a genuine interest. A generous donor to various causes. He knew the routine well: show up, smile politely, write a check, and leave without looking back. Tonight was no different, or at least, it wasn't supposed to be. He barely stepped inside when something shifted. A strange, almost electric pull in his chest made him pause. His eyes swept over the children assembled on the small makeshift stage, fidgeting nervously under the warm glow of stage lights. They were dressed in simple blue and white choir robes, standing in neat rows as they prepared to sing. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, pushing away the vague unease creeping up his spine. He had never been sentimental about these things. Children's choirs, orphanage performances, these were just feel-good moments for those who wanted to believe they were making a difference. And yet, something felt different tonight. Then, he saw her. A girl, small and delicate, stood near the center of the stage. The soft amber light caught the contours of her face, highlighting the fine curve of her jaw and the faint dimple that flickered when she took a breath. She couldn't have been older than 10, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, not timid, not bold, but somewhere in between. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, a few stray strands falling over her forehead. Nathaniel's body tensed, his breath coming shorter. There was something familiar about her, painfully familiar. The moment the music began, his pulse stuttered. Her chin lifted slightly as the first note of the song hummed through the aging speakers, her dark lashes flickering as she focused on something distant, something only she could see. And then, the tilt of her head, almost imperceptible, subtle, but to Nathaniel, it was a lightning strike. Eleanor used to do that. A cold wave of nausea rolled through him. The air felt thin, suddenly insufficient, and he had to press a hand against the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. His mind scrambled for logic, for reason. It had been nearly 10 years since Eleanor died. 10 years since the sea had taken her, and with her, their daughter, Lily. And yet, the girl on the stage was standing there right in front of him. Nathaniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. But the pull was relentless. His gaze found her again. And this time, he took in everything: the delicate slant of her nose, the sharp yet soft angles of her face, the way she pressed her lips together as she concentrated. She was the living, breathing reflection of Eleanor, and that resemblance wasn't fleeting. It wasn't just his grief playing tricks on him. It was real. The performance ended, the last lingering note fading into the silence of the room before polite applause filled the space. The children on stage giggled, exchanging shy glances as they stepped down in neat rows. Some whispered excitedly, delighted by the attention. The girl in the blue dress, though, didn't rush like the others. She moved slower, more measured, as if she knew she wasn't like them. Nathaniel's heart pounded as he tracked her movements. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his nails biting into his palms. This is impossible. His rational mind screamed at him to stop, to turn away, to leave it alone. He had spent years training himself to ignore false hope, to silence the ache in his chest whenever he caught glimpses of Eleanor's face in passing strangers or imagined Lily's laughter in a child's voice at the park. It had never meant anything. It was never real. But then the girl turned fully toward the crowd, and his world tilted on its axis. Nathaniel gripped the edge of a nearby chair as a hollow ache spread through his ribs. His breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. The applause around him became distant noise, a meaningless hum drowned out by the roaring in his ears. He felt like he was drowning, just as he had the day he got the call about the accident. The day he lost everything. This wasn't some fleeting resemblance. This wasn't a ghost of the past haunting him through a trick of the light. This was real. The girl, Lily, his daughter, who was supposed to be dead, was standing in an orphanage, wearing a simple blue dress, looking up at one of the caretakers as if this was her life. As if she had never belonged anywhere else. His breath hitched when she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Then spoke softly to the woman beside her. He couldn't hear the words. Couldn't process the conversation around him. He was barely aware of his own body moving. His feet weaving through the crowd with single-minded focus. Near the entrance, a woman in a navy blouse was organizing donation envelopes at a table. He vaguely remembered shaking her hand upon arrival. Remembered her introducing herself, Madeline Porter, the orphanage director. Her handshake had been firm but warm. The kind of person who had seen too much and yet still chose to care. Nathaniel cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain even. The girl in the choir. He said, second row, dark hair, blue dress. Who is she? Madeline looked up, surprised by the urgency in his tone. She followed his gaze toward the now empty stage before offering a practiced smile. That would be Rose, she said. She's been here since she was a baby. Nathaniel's pulse stuttered. Since she was a baby. Madeline nodded, flipping open a well-worn registry book beside her. She was brought to us when she was just over a year old. A woman named Susan dropped her off. But we were never able to track down any biological family. Nathaniel barely heard the rest of her words. His eyes locked onto the single name scrawled in faded ink across the registry page. Rose. No last name, no records of family, just a child who had appeared one day with nowhere to go. A decade ago, he had buried his wife. He had grieved a daughter whose body was never found. And now, in the quiet of an orphanage on the outskirts of the city, he was staring at the impossible. Something inside him shifted. He wasn't done here. Not yet. Nathaniel Carter had built an empire on logic and control. On the ability to assess, react, and move forward without being shaken by emotion. He had climbed to the top by calculating risk, by understanding probability, by never allowing himself to be ruled by anything as fragile as hope. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a dimly lit orphanage hallway, staring at a worn-out registry book that was shaking in his grip. His pulse thundered in his ears as he read the name again. Rose. No last name, no family records, found when she was a year old. It was impossible. It was unreal. And yet, the moment he saw her on stage, something inside him had fractured. That girl, Rose, wasn't just a resemblance. Wasn't just another child whose features reminded him of Eleanor. No, this was different. He could feel it in his bones. In the way the air had turned thick when their eyes met. It was the way she moved. The way she tilted her head. The way she focused so intensely on her sketchbook in the courtyard the next day. As if the entire world around her was nothing more than background noise. Just like Eleanor had. Just like Lily. The girl was his daughter. And yet, she didn't know it. Nathaniel had thought about walking away. He had told himself it was delusion. That it was a coincidence too cruel to entertain. But something inside him, something deeper than reason, something beyond all logic, wouldn't let him leave. So he returned. Again. And again. At first, he told himself it was just to be sure. Then, he told himself it was to find proof. And then, he stopped lying to himself altogether. Every time Nathaniel stepped through the orphanage's iron gates, he felt something shift inside him, like a rope pulling taut around his chest. Refusing to let go. Rose was always in the courtyard when he arrived, sitting on the same weathered wooden bench beneath the large elm tree. She never looked surprised to see him. She didn't ask questions. Didn't seem particularly interested in why a wealthy businessman suddenly had an interest in an orphanage he had previously only ever donated to from a distance. She would watch him, sometimes only for a moment, sometimes longer, her dark eyes unreadable. And when she returned to her sketchbook, he found himself watching her, memorizing the way her fingers moved across the page. The way she shaded in her lines carefully, deliberately, as if creating a world only she could step into. One afternoon, he finally spoke. "You're talented," he said, standing a few steps away from the bench. Rose didn't flinch, didn't look startled. She simply glanced up, considering him for a moment before offering a small shrug. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but not timid, controlled, but not detached. It was the voice of someone who had learned not to expect anything from anyone. Nathaniel hesitated before stepping closer, peering down at the paper in her lap. His breath hitched. She was drawing the ocean. Dark waves curled toward the shore. The sky a careful blend of shadow and light, as if she had captured the very moment when day turns to dusk. It was uncanny, not just the detail, but the way the entire scene felt alive. His fingers curled against his palm. Eleanor used to draw like this. So did Lily. You like the ocean? He asked. His voice even. Rose nodded, eyes still on her sketch. I like how it moves. It never really stops. Nathaniel's throat tightened. Eleanor had said that. Once, he could still hear her voice in his mind. Clear and warm, whispering about how the sea was wild and free. Unpredictable but beautiful. How she wanted Lily to be like the ocean. To move through life unafraid. He forced himself to breathe. To focus. He couldn't let himself fall apart now. Have you ever seen it? He asked. Rose hesitated, then shook her head. Not that I remember. Her voice was careful, almost distant, and something inside him fractured even further. She didn't remember. She didn't remember who she was, who she had been, who she belonged to. And yet, her hands still remembered the ocean. Her fingers still knew how to bring it to life on a page. It was the scar that finally shattered him. A few weeks had passed. Nathaniel had tried to pace himself, to think before he acted, but patience had never been his strength. That afternoon, Rose had been sitting beneath the same elm tree, sketching again. It was the first time he had seen her without her sweater. And there, beneath the soft light of the late afternoon sun, just below the bend of her elbow, was a scar. Small, crescent-shaped, faint, but unmistakable. Nathaniel had frozen on the spot. He knew that scar. He had held her tiny arm in his hands when she had gotten it. When she had toddled too fast toward him in the garden, stumbling over her own feet and catching her arm against the low branch of a bush. He had been the one to press a damp cloth against the wound, whispering soothing words as Lily sniffled in his arms. And now, 10 years later, the scar was still there. That was the moment he knew. This wasn't just grief playing tricks on him. This wasn't his mind grasping at false hope. It was her. And then, the final blow. When she lifted her hand to scratch her collarbone, the thin silver chain around her neck slipped into view. Nathaniel's entire world stopped. A small, fish-shaped pendant hung from the chain. It was the same pendant he had designed for Lily's first birthday. A one-of-a-kind piece. Custom-made. Given to her by Eleanor. There was only one in existence. And it was hanging around Rose's neck. His breath caught. His vision blurred. His fingers moved before he could stop them. Reaching out. Brushing against the pendant. Rose flinched slightly but didn't pull away. She glanced up at him. Her expression unreadable. Where did you get this? Nathaniel's voice was rough. Strained. Barely above a whisper. Rose frowned slightly. I've always had it. Nathaniel's fingers tightened around the pendant. His body trembling with the sheer weight of the moment. It wasn't a delusion. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a dream. She was real. Rose, Lily, was alive. And she had no idea who he was. No idea what had been stolen from her. No idea that she had been lost. Not abandoned. Nathaniel had spent 10 years mourning a daughter he thought had drowned. Grieving over an empty casket. Whispering apologies into the silence. Wishing he had never let her go to the ocean that day. And yet, she had survived. She had been washed ashore. Rescued. Given a new life. A new name. A new story. She had grown up without him. And now, he had to tell her the truth. He had to bring her home. Even if she never forgave him. Even if she never remembered. Because no matter how much time had passed, no matter how much had been lost, she was still his daughter. And he was never letting her go again. Nathaniel Carter sat in his car outside St. Catherine's Orphanage, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The world around him blurred, reduced to nothing but the weight of the realization crashing down on him. He had spent 10 years mourning his daughter. 10 years believing the ocean had swallowed her whole. And yet, she was here. The girl inside that orphanage was Lily. Not a look-alike. Not a coincidence. His daughter. And she didn't even know it. Nathaniel inhaled sharply, forcing himself to breathe. He had to think. Had to be rational. Had to be sure. Because if this was real, if this wasn't just some cruel trick of fate, then everything he had believed for the past decade was a lie. He had grieved an empty grave. He had let go of a child who had never truly been lost. And now, she had no idea who he was. I need proof. He wasn't going to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Not yet. He had to be absolutely certain before he did anything. If he was wrong, if he was seeing ghosts where there were none, he wouldn't survive the disappointment. And so, he started digging. The first step was finding out everything he could about Rose, the name she had been given by the orphanage. Madeline Porter, the orphanage director, had been hesitant when he asked for details. She wasn't an easy woman to manipulate, and she had spent years protecting the children under her care from people who came in with empty promises and good intentions that never lasted. But Nathaniel wasn't just another benefactor. So he pushed. And eventually, he got what little information there was. She was brought here as a baby, Madeline said, flipping through the old, faded registry book. A woman named Susan dropped her off and disappeared. We never found any records of biological family. No birth certificate, no paperwork, just a baby with no past. Nathaniel stared at the words written in black ink, his breath catching in his throat. No birth certificate, no records, no history. Just a child who had appeared one day with nowhere to go. She's been here ever since? His voice was rough, uneven. Madeline nodded. She never got adopted. She never asked to be. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. She never asked? Madeline hesitated. Most of the kids, they long for families. They dream of the day someone walks through those doors and chooses them. But Rose, she never did. She never talks about wanting a home. She never asks about her past. It's like she doesn't let herself believe in it. A cold weight settled in Nathaniel's stomach. Because she doesn't remember. Because she had been taken by the ocean, washed ashore, and given a name that wasn't hers. Because she had once belonged somewhere else. But no one had come for her. And he hadn't come for her. Nathaniel clenched his fists, guilt slamming into him like a physical force. His daughter had spent years alone in this place, believing she was no one. And he had let her. Nathaniel didn't know how to approach her. How do you tell a child that their entire life has been a mistake? That the people who were supposed to find them never did? That they were loved, but lost? So he watched. And the more time he spent at the orphanage, the more undeniable the truth became. It was the little things at first. The way her fingers curled around a pencil just like Eleanor's did. The way she moved through the world quietly, observing everything without ever asking for attention. But then, it was the scar. He saw it one afternoon when she had pushed up the sleeve of her sweater, absent-mindedly rubbing her arm. It was small, barely noticeable, but he noticed it. Because he knew that scar. Because he had been there when she got it. 10 years ago. In a house that had once been filled with laughter. In a garden where she had run toward him on unsteady legs. Her little feet kicking up dirt as she giggled. Arms outstretched. And then, the stumble. The fall. The sharp cry that had sent him running. He had scooped her up, held her tight, pressed a damp cloth to her arm as she whimpered into his shoulder. And now, 10 years later, the scar was still there. He had buried his grief in a grave that had never held his daughter. And now she was right in front of him. But she had no idea who he was. Nathaniel should have said something then. Should have told her. Should have made her see. But fear held him back. What if she didn't believe him? What if she had been through too much? Had built her walls too high to let herself hope? What if she looked at him with the same empty, unreadable expression she gave everyone else, and walked away? So he waited. And then, fate made the choice for him. It was late one evening when he found her sitting alone in the courtyard. The last hints of daylight painting the sky in muted golds and grays. She was sketching again, her fingers smudged with charcoal. And when she shifted slightly, lifting a hand to scratch at her collarbone, something slipped from beneath her sweater. A thin, silver chain, a pendant dangling from it. Nathaniel's chest constricted so violently he couldn't breathe. It was a small, fish-shaped pendant, the one he had designed for Lily's first birthday. The one-of-a-kind piece Eleanor had chosen, because she had wanted Lily to always have the ocean close to her heart. There was only one in existence. And it was around Rose's neck. His breath came out uneven, ragged. His body felt like it had turned to stone. This was it. This was proof. This was his daughter. And she had no idea. His fingers moved before he could stop them, reaching out, brushing against the pendant lightly, as if testing whether it was real. Rose flinched slightly but didn't pull away. She looked up at him, eyes narrowing. Where did you get this? Nathaniel's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. She frowned slightly. I've always had it. His stomach lurched. I don't remember where it came from. She added, almost as an afterthought. It's just always been mine. Nathaniel felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. She didn't remember. But she had never let go of it. She had kept it close. Even when everything else had been taken from her. Nathaniel's hands shook. How do you tell a child that they were never meant to be here? How do you tell them that they were loved? They were searched for, but no one found them in time? How do you tell them that you failed them? His voice broke when he finally spoke. Rose. She frowned, tilting her head slightly. Why do you care? Nathaniel swallowed hard, his throat raw, his vision blurring. Because you're mine. Because you were never supposed to be here. Because I buried an empty casket thinking you were gone forever. And now I have to tell you the truth. Nathaniel Carter had never been a man who allowed uncertainty to control him. He was calculated, methodical, a man who bent the world to his will. Never the other way around. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of his office at midnight, surrounded by documents, photos, and endless dead ends, trying to piece together a decade-old mystery that should have never existed. His daughter had been declared dead. He had grieved. He had stood at an empty grave. And now, she was alive, living under a name that wasn't hers, growing up without the father who had spent 10 years mourning her loss. How had this happened? Nathaniel inhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. His thoughts were a storm. His emotions a tangled mess of relief, guilt, and something far darker. He had never been a weak man. But tonight, he felt like one. Because if Rose was truly Lily, if his daughter had been alive all these years, that meant one thing. Someone had stolen her, and he was going to find out who. Nathaniel had hired the best private investigator in the country. He wasn't going to waste time waiting for answers that might never come. He was going to demand them. The first name on his list? Susan, the woman who had dropped Rose off at the orphanage and vanished. Madeline Porter had told him the truth. There were no records, no paperwork, just a first name scrawled onto a worn-out orphanage registry. But people didn't just disappear. Nathaniel sat in his office, watching as his investigator paced the room, flipping through a folder filled with old records, surveillance searches, and missing persons reports. We found her, the investigator said finally, his voice grim. Susan Wheeler. She lived in a coastal village 9 years ago. Nathaniel stilled. His grip on the arm of his chair tightened. Where is she now? His voice was lethal, sharp, controlled, but his heart was pounding. The investigator hesitated. She's still there. Nathaniel shot up from his seat. Then let's go. The drive was long and silent. The city lights fading into empty highways. Then winding coastal roads. The ocean stretched out beside them. Dark and endless. The waves crashing against the shore like a distant heartbeat. Nathaniel barely noticed. All he could see was Lily's face. The way she had looked at him in the orphanage courtyard. The way her fingers had curled around her sketchbook. The way she had spoken, soft, careful, guarded. His daughter, who had grown up alone. And Susan Wheeler knew why. The investigator pulled onto a narrow dirt road, the headlights illuminating a small, worn-down house, perched at the edge of a cliffside. The ocean stretched behind it, vast and cruel, and Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. This is where my daughter was taken. He stepped out of the car, his breath cold in the night air. He walked up to the door, lifted his hand, and knocked. A pause. Then, slow, careful footsteps. The door creaked open. A woman with silver-streaked hair and tired blue eyes stood before him. Her face was lined with age. But there was something else there too, something sharp, something wary. She knew who he was. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. You must be Susan Wheeler. She exhaled, leaning against the doorway, her arms crossed. I figured you'd come one day. His stomach clenched. Then you knew who she was, he said, his voice dangerously low. You knew, and you never said a word. Susan sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Nathaniel hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The house was small, cluttered, filled with the scent of salt air and old wood. It felt lived in, yet strangely empty, as if the past still lingered in the walls. She gestured toward a wooden table. Sit. Nathaniel didn't move. I don't want tea, he said coldly. I want answers. Susan nodded slowly, then took a deep breath. It was a storm. she said. Nathaniel stilled. A bad one, she continued, her voice quiet but firm. The kind that turns the ocean wild. The kind that makes it take things it has no right to take. Nathaniel's fingers curled into fists. I was out on the water the morning after. Susan went on, her gaze distant, like she was reliving something too painful to bear. I found her, half buried in the sand. Small, cold, barely breathing. His heart stopped. She found her? She saved her? Nathaniel swallowed against the burn in his throat. And you kept her? Susan flinched at the accusation. I didn't know who she was. No one did. No boats had capsized. No missing child reports. She was just there. And I was alone. My husband was gone. I had no one. Nathaniel's jaw locked. So you took her. I tried to care for her. Susan whispered. I really did. But I wasn't enough. She needed more than I could give her. So I brought her to the orphanage. You left her there. His voice was hoarse, raw, shaking. Susan met his gaze. I thought someone would come for her. Nathaniel's breath caught. Someone should have. He should have. But he had spent 10 years believing she was dead. 10 years believing she had drowned. 10 years grieving the loss of a child who had been alive the whole time. His hands shook. You had no right, he whispered, his voice breaking. You had no right to keep her from me. Susan exhaled, her shoulders sagging. I know. Silence stretched between them. The wind howled outside, the waves crashing against the cliffs. Nathaniel turned away, pressing a hand against his temple. His mind was a mess. His emotions a storm, but through it all, one thought remained. Lily had survived. She had survived. And now, he had to bring her home. Nathaniel left Susan's house just before dawn. He didn't speak to the investigator. He didn't stop to process. There was only one thing left to do. He had to tell her. He had to tell Rose, Lily, his daughter, that everything she had known was a lie. That she wasn't just another child in an orphanage. That she had a home. That she had a father. And this time, he wasn't going to lose her again. He pulled onto the orphanage's gravel driveway, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly he thought he might break it. His chest felt too tight, his breath too uneven. How do you tell a child that they were never meant to be lost? How do you tell them that they were loved, but forgotten? How do you make them believe in something they've never had? Nathaniel stepped out of the car, his body rigid, his heart pounding. And then, he saw her, sitting alone in the courtyard, her sketchbook in her lap, her expression quiet, distant, unknowingly waiting for the truth that would change everything. Nathaniel took a step forward. His voice was raw, unsteady, but firm. Rose. She looked up. He took a breath. You are my daughter. If this moment touched your heart, leave a like to support Nathaniel's journey. Comment below. How do you think Rose will react? Will she believe him? Let's discuss. Your support encourages more powerful stories like this. Share this with someone who needs an emotional story today. Nathaniel Carter had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless business rivals, and the unrelenting pressure of an empire he had built from the ground up. But nothing, had ever left him as vulnerable as this moment. He stood in the orphanage courtyard, the scent of damp earth lingering in the crisp morning air, his heartbeat a storm in his chest. And there she was, his daughter. She sat on a worn wooden bench, her sketchbook balanced on her lap, the tip of her pencil hovering midair. Her dark eyes flicked toward him, full of quiet curiosity, not expecting anything, not hoping for anything, just watching. For 10 years, Nathaniel had dreamed of this moment. For 10 years, he had imagined what he would say if, by some impossible twist of fate, his daughter was alive. But now, standing here, face to face with her, his voice was trapped in his throat. How do you tell a child that her entire life has been a mistake? How do you tell her that she wasn't abandoned, wasn't forgotten, that she was stolen from a life she never got to remember? How do you tell her that the man standing before her, a stranger, isn't just another donor, another visitor, another well-meaning adult passing through her life? That he is her father? Nathaniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. Rose, his voice cracked, but he didn't care. I need to tell you something. She blinked at him, tilting her head slightly, waiting. She was so still, so controlled, too controlled for a 10-year-old girl. Like she had trained herself never to expect too much. Like she had spent her entire life bracing for disappointment. Nathaniel took a step closer, his breath unsteady. I need you to listen carefully. Okay? She nodded once. Slow, cautious. His heart thundered. His entire world balanced on the next words that left his mouth. He exhaled shakily. A long time ago, he began, there was a man who had a wife he loved more than anything. And together, they had a daughter. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition. Or maybe just curiosity. He forced himself to continue. One day, the man had to leave for work. He was gone for only a little while, but while he was away, something terrible happened. His wife and daughter went to the ocean. Rose's fingers tightened around the edge of her sketchbook. Nathaniel swallowed against the tightness in his throat. A storm came, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And the wife, she didn't survive. Rose inhaled sharply, her posture going rigid. But the daughter, Nathaniel continued, she was lost, swept away. Silence. A silence so thick it wrapped around them. Suffocating. And then, the softest whisper. Why are you telling me this? Her voice was careful, measured, but there was something else beneath it. Something fragile, something breaking. Nathaniel forced himself to meet her gaze. Because, Rose, he took a breath. You are that little girl. Her whole body went still. Nathaniel felt it happen, the moment her world cracked open. The moment her carefully built walls trembled. The moment the truth began seeping in through the cracks. She blinked, her lips parting slightly. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers curled around her sweater, gripping the fabric like it was the only thing holding her together. No, she whispered. Nathaniel's chest tightened painfully. You were lost, he said, his voice breaking, but you survived. You were found. And now, his breath shuddered. Now, I've found you. She shook her head slowly, as if trying to force his words out of existence. But her voice trailed off. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing turning uneven. Nathaniel took a careful step forward, lowering himself onto the bench beside her, giving her space but refusing to let her slip away. Rose, his voice was gentle. Your real name is Lily. Her breath hitched. Her voice shook. And suddenly, she was pushing to her feet, her arms wrapping around herself like she was trying to protect something inside her from shattering completely. Nathaniel stood too, his hands trembling at his sides. I know it's a lot, he said quickly. I know this doesn't make sense right now. But I don't remember. Her voice cracked, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Tears burned in Nathaniel's eyes. You don't have to, he whispered. You don't have to remember for it to be true. Her hands clenched into fists. I've always been Rose, she murmured. I don't know how to be Lily. Nathaniel's throat ached. You don't have to be anything you're not ready for, he told her softly. You just have to know that you're not alone anymore. Her shoulders trembled. Nathaniel's heart ached at the way she was fighting this. The way she was trying to push it down. Trying to make it untrue. But it was true. She was his daughter. She had always been. And then, with a choked, broken sound, Rose, Lily, took a shaky step forward. Nathaniel barely had time to react before she was crashing into his chest. Her small arms wrapping around him in a desperate, trembling grip. A sob tore from her throat, muffled against his sweater. Nathaniel's arms wrapped around her instantly, his entire body shaking with emotion, with the unbearable weight of finally holding his daughter again after so many years. I don't remember you, she sobbed into his chest. Nathaniel pressed his lips against her hair, his tears slipping into her dark curls. It's okay, he whispered. You don't have to. She clutched onto him, shaking, breaking, letting herself feel something for the first time in years. Nathaniel held her tighter, anchoring her, promising her with every fiber of his being that she was home now. You're my dad, she whispered, the words barely audible. A sound escaped Nathaniel's throat, something between a sob and a laugh, something raw and full of years of unspoken grief, endless love, and finally, hope. Yes, he whispered, his voice breaking. You always have been. Nathaniel Carter had spent 10 years drowning in the loss of his wife and daughter, suffocating under the weight of guilt, regret, and an ache that never left him. But now, as he stood in his dimly lit office, surrounded by files, records, and the cold, brutal reality staring back at him from the pages of an investigator's report, he realized something far worse than grief. His wife's death had not been an accident. His daughter's disappearance had not been fate's cruel hand. It had been murder. Nathaniel's fingers tightened around the report. His knuckles white as his entire world tilted beneath him. The words swam on the page, the sentences cutting through his mind like shards of glass. The boat Helen had taken that day, the boat she had believed was safe, had been tampered with. The fuel lines had been cut. The emergency raft slashed beyond repair. Nathaniel's breath turned shallow, rage burning through his veins like a wildfire. He had spent years believing he had lost them to the ocean, when in reality, someone had made sure they never came back. Someone had taken Helen from him. Someone had tried to take Lily too. And that someone was still out there. Nathaniel forced himself to move, to focus, to read every excruciating detail in the file. His investigator had been thorough, relentless, ruthless. The man Nathaniel had hired was not one to leave loose ends, not when his employer was the kind of man who could ruin lives with a single phone call. And now, staring at the last page of the report, Nathaniel saw the name that had haunted him for years. Vincent Bryant, a ghost from his past. A name he hadn't spoken in a decade, but one that had never truly left him. Vincent had been a business rival, a man hungry for power, desperate to take what wasn't his. Nathaniel had crushed him in a deal once, exposed him for the fraud that he was, left him with nothing but his arrogance and his rage. But back then, Nathaniel had believed that was where their story had ended. He had been wrong. Vincent had wanted revenge. And now, Nathaniel knew exactly how far he had been willing to go to get it. His hands shook as he set the file down on his desk. The city outside his window stretched on, endless and indifferent, lights flickering in the dark like distant stars. But inside, Nathaniel's entire world was burning. For years, he had grieved Helen's death, had lived with the weight of losing both of them to the ocean's mercy. He had believed he was powerless. But now, he knew the truth, and he wasn't powerless anymore. Nathaniel had spent his life mastering control over his business, over his emotions, over everything that could be calculated, predicted, and conquered. But tonight, control felt like a foreign concept. Tonight, he was just a man who had lost everything, who had spent a decade believing a lie, who now had the power to set it right. And yet, as he sat in his office, the file still open before him, his mind kept drifting to one thing. Lily. She had no idea. She didn't know that the same man who had stolen her mother's life had tried to take hers too. She didn't know that Nathaniel had spent the last few days unraveling a nightmare that had been hidden for a decade, finding the pieces of a puzzle he had never even known existed. And now, he had a choice. He could go after Vincent Bryant. He could make him pay for what he had done. He could ruin him, crush him into the ground, take away everything he had left. But what then? What would that give him? Would it bring Helen back? Would it give Lily back the life she had lost? No, it wouldn't give him what he really wanted. What he wanted was for Lily to be safe, to be happy, to have the life she had been robbed of. And if he let revenge consume him, if he let the anger burning in his veins lead his actions, then he would lose the one thing that mattered. He would lose her. Nathaniel leaned forward, pressing his elbows against his desk, running a hand through his hair. His decision had been made. He wouldn't kill Vincent Bryant. He would destroy him, legally, permanently, without bloodshed, because that's what Helen would have wanted. And that's what Lily needed. Nathaniel wasn't sure how much Lily could handle, if she was ready to hear the truth, if she could even begin to process the weight of it. But he knew one thing. He couldn't keep this from her. So that night, as the city stretched silent around them, he found himself standing outside her bedroom door. He knocked gently. There was a pause, then a soft, "Come in." Nathaniel pushed the door open. Stepping inside, Lily sat on the edge of her bed, her knees drawn to her chest, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the silver pendant around her neck, the pendant he had given her all those years ago. His chest tightened painfully. She still didn't remember, but she still held onto it. Nathaniel took a slow breath. "Lily, we need to talk." She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. He sat down beside her, the bed dipping slightly under his weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, it wasn't an accident. Lily stilled. She turned to look at him, confusion flickering across her face. "What?" she whispered. Nathaniel exhaled, his hands clasped together. "The day your mother died, the boat she was on, it wasn't just an accident." Someone made sure she wouldn't survive that storm. Lily's breath hitched. He saw it happen. The way the world seemed to shift around her. The way her mind tried to make sense of something too impossible to believe. Who? Her voice was small. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. A man named Vincent Bryant. She didn't know the name. But she knew what it meant. Someone had killed her mother. Someone had tried to kill her too. Nathaniel saw the moment the realization hit her. Saw the way her hands curled into fists. The way her body tensed like she was bracing for a wave she couldn't stop. But why? She whispered. Because I destroyed his life. Nathaniel said honestly. And he wanted to destroy mine. Silence. Then, what happens now? Nathaniel turned to her. And for the first time in a long time, he knew the answer. I bring him to justice. He said, the right way. Lily's fingers trembled slightly against her sweater. Then, slowly, she nodded. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten, not just from the weight of the past, but from the quiet, tentative trust in her eyes. She wasn't ready to call him dad yet, but she was ready to believe that he would protect her. And for now, that was enough. Nathaniel Carter sat in the dim glow of his study. His fingers curled around the edge of his desk. His breath slow but heavy. Like a storm brewing beneath the surface. The weight of 10 years of grief, rage, and unbearable loss sat in his chest like a stone. In front of him lay Vincent Bryant's file. The evidence stacked neatly in a thick folder. The proof that his rival, the man who had once been nothing more than a bitter loser in a business war, had turned into a murderer. Vincent had orchestrated Helen's death. He had tried to take Lily from him too. Nathaniel had spent the past few days struggling against his instincts. Against the dark, primal urge clawing at his chest. The urge to hunt the man down himself. To tear him apart with his bare hands. But he had made a choice. Not for himself. For Lily. Because vengeance wouldn't bring Helen back. It wouldn't give Lily back the years she had lost. The childhood that had been stolen from her. Justice was the only thing that mattered now. The only thing that would make sure Vincent Bryant never hurt anyone ever again. The soft creak of the study door broke through his thoughts. Nathaniel turned, his breath catching when he saw Lily standing in the doorway. She had been so quiet, so careful around him since he told her the truth. She wasn't running from him, but she wasn't quite ready to step fully into this new life either. And he didn't blame her. She had spent her entire life believing she was alone, without a past, without a family. And now, she had one, but what was she supposed to do with it? She hesitated before stepping inside, her arms wrapped around herself, her fingers gripping the sleeves of her sweater like she was trying to hold onto something solid. Nathaniel watched her carefully, keeping his movements slow, controlled. She was brave, stronger than anyone he had ever known, but she had spent years building walls to keep herself from feeling too much. From hoping for things she couldn't have. And now, she was trying to let him in. He just had to be patient. Lily's gaze flickered to the file on his desk. The name Vincent Bryant glaring back at her in bold letters. Her brows furrowed slightly. Is that him? She asked. Her voice quiet but steady. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Yes. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her fingers trailing hesitantly along the edge of the desk, like she was testing the weight of the truth before fully accepting it. And then, softly, what are you going to do? Nathaniel met her gaze, his heart tightening. What he said next would define everything. Lily was watching him carefully, waiting for his answer, not just because she wanted to know, but because she was trying to understand who he was, who her father was. Nathaniel took a slow breath. I'm going to make sure he pays, he said, his voice steady, the right way. Lily's fingers twitched against the desk. Her voice was barely a whisper. You're not going to hurt him? He knew what she was asking. He knew what she was afraid of. She had spent her entire life in a world where people left. Where people made choices that hurt. Where trust was a luxury she had never been given. And now, she was watching him, waiting to see if he would be different. Nathaniel's chest ached. He could have told her yes. He wanted revenge. That he wanted to hunt Vincent down. Make him suffer. Make him feel every ounce of pain he had caused. Because, in the darkest parts of himself, he did want that. But then he thought of Helen. Of the way she had believed in justice over revenge. In kindness over cruelty. In fighting for what was right instead of what was easy. And he thought of Lily. The girl who had spent years believing she had no one. Who had survived without knowing where she belonged. She needed more than a father who wanted revenge. She needed one who would choose the right thing, even when it hurt. Nathaniel swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. "No," he said finally. "I won't hurt him." Lily's fingers clenched slightly, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked. Nathaniel exhaled. "Because it won't bring your mother back. And it won't fix what he did to you." Lily's breath hitched. She didn't move, but he saw the way her body tensed. The way she curled in on herself slightly, as if trying to process something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Because this wasn't just about Helen. It was about her. About the life that had been taken from her. The years she had spent alone. The memories she had lost. It was about the girl who had never let herself hope for a family, because no one had ever come for her before. Nathaniel felt the words rising in his throat before he could stop them. "But I'm here now." Lily's breath hitched. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, there was something different in her gaze. Not hesitation, not wariness, but a flicker of belief. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Nathaniel's chest tightened painfully. She still didn't remember him. She still didn't call him Dad. But in that moment, she believed him, and that was enough. 2 weeks later, Vincent Bryant was arrested. The charges were airtight: tampering with a boat leading to a wrongful death. Conspiracy. Attempted murder. Nathaniel had made sure there were no loopholes. No ways out. No second chances. Vincent would spend the rest of his life behind bars. And yet, when the news broke, when Nathaniel sat in his car, watching the footage on the screen of his phone, he felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Because no amount of justice could bring Helen back. And no amount of punishment could undo what had been stolen from Lily. But then, the passenger door opened. Lily slid into the seat beside him. Her hands curled in her lap. Her gaze flickering to the screen. She didn't say anything at first. Then, quietly, "He can't hurt us anymore." Nathaniel turned to look at her. "Us. Not just me. Us." His breath caught. He wanted to say something to let her know how much that word meant. But before he could, she took a slow, uncertain breath and whispered, "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Nathaniel's chest ached. He reached over, wrapping his hand gently around hers, holding it with the same quiet steadiness he had once held her with when she was just a baby in his arms. "Yeah," he whispered, "I think she would be." And for the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel Carter felt something he thought he had lost forever. Peace. Nathaniel Carter had spent 10 years trapped in grief, living in a world that felt hollow and incomplete without his wife and daughter. For a decade, he had walked through life as a ghost, carrying an unbearable weight in his chest, breathing but never really alive. But today, as he stood at the gates of St. Catherine's orphanage, waiting for his daughter, the little girl who had once been lost to him, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. Lily stood just inside the gate, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her arms wrapped around herself like she wasn't sure whether she should be excited or afraid. Her home, this orphanage, this place where she had grown up believing she had no family, no past, no one waiting for her, was all she had ever known. Now, she was about to leave it behind. Nathaniel's heart clenched as he watched her say her goodbyes. The younger children clung to her, their small hands gripping her sweater, their voices tight with emotion. "You'll forget us," one little girl whispered, her face pressed against Lily's side. Lily swallowed hard, crouching down to meet the little girl's tear-filled eyes. "I won't," she promised softly. "You swear?" Lily took the girl's tiny hand, squeezing it gently. "I swear." Nathaniel watched the exchange, his throat tight. He had seen a lot in his life, deals worth millions. Cities built from the ground up. Fortunes gained and lost. But this, watching Lily, seeing the way she held herself together, the way she comforted others even when she was uncertain herself, this was the most incredible thing he had ever witnessed. She was brave in a way he had never been. And she was his. Finally, after a long, lingering goodbye, she turned toward him. Nathaniel met her gaze. She didn't run to him. She didn't throw herself into his arms. She simply nodded. A quiet acceptance. A choice. She was ready to come home. The drive home was quiet. Nathaniel didn't push her to talk. He let her sit in silence. lost in thought, her fingers curled against the strap of her bag, her eyes flickering toward the passing city lights. When they reached the mansion, the house that had once been filled with laughter. Then silence. And now something new entirely. Nathaniel felt a strange sort of nervousness settle in his chest. Would she feel out of place? Would this house feel too big, too empty, too much like a stranger's home rather than her own? He didn't want her to feel like a guest. He wanted her to feel like she belonged. He carried her bag upstairs, stopping at the door of the room he had prepared for her. She hesitated before stepping inside. The room wasn't extravagant. It wasn't filled with luxury or things to impress her. It was warm, soft, a space that could become hers. Her fingers brushed against the new sketchbooks and pencils sitting on the desk. Her gaze flickered to the ocean painting on the wall, the one Helen had painted years ago. Nathaniel saw the way her throat moved, the way she blinked too quickly. She recognized it. She didn't remember, but she knew. Lily turned back to him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Did Mom really paint that?" Nathaniel's chest ached. He nodded. She did. Lily ran her fingers over the frame, her expression unreadable. Then, almost shyly, she murmured, "She was really good." Nathaniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah," he whispered, "she was." Lily stood there for a long time, just looking at the painting. Then, quietly, so quietly Nathaniel almost missed it, she said, "I think I'd like to learn." His breath caught. She didn't remember Helen, but she wanted to. Nathaniel's vision blurred, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "I'd love that." The weeks that followed were slow, uncertain, but filled with small moments that meant everything. Lily didn't call him Dad. Not yet, but she let him tuck her in at night. She let him help her with schoolwork, even when she insisted she didn't need help. She let him sit with her as she sketched, as she tried to remember things that refused to come back. One afternoon, Nathaniel found her sitting in Helen's old art studio, flipping through an old sketchbook. He stepped inside, his heart tight with emotion. "Lily?" She didn't look up. Instead, she traced the edge of one of the drawings, a sketch of a mother holding a child by the ocean. After a long moment, she whispered, "She really loved me, didn't she?" Nathaniel's breath hitched. He walked over, kneeling beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the sketchbook. "She loved you more than anything in this world," he murmured. Lily was silent, her gaze never leaving the drawing. Then, in the smallest voice, she admitted, "I wish I could remember." Nathaniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her that it didn't matter. That love wasn't just in memories, but in the way it shaped us, in the way it never truly left, even when time tried to erase it. But all he could do was wrap an arm around her and whisper, "You don't have to remember for it to be true." Lily let out a shaky breath. And, for the first time, she leaned into him. It happened late one night. Nathaniel had been working in his office when he heard soft footsteps at the door. He turned, surprised to see Lily standing there, her arms wrapped around herself, looking uncertain. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. He gestured toward the couch. "Come sit with me." She crossed the room slowly, curling up on the couch, her expression unreadable. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so small it nearly broke him, she whispered, "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Nathaniel felt his heart crack open. He turned to face her fully, his expression gentle but serious. "Lily," he said softly, "she would be the proudest mother in the world." Lily bit her lip, looking down at her hands. Then, almost hesitantly, she whispered, "You're proud of me too, right?" Nathaniel's breath caught. He reached over, gently taking her hand in his. "More than you'll ever know." Lily let out a shaky breath. Then, after a long pause, she whispered something that made everything stop. Something that shattered the last of the distance between them. Something that he had been waiting for, but never pushing, never rushing. She looked up at him with uncertain, vulnerable eyes. And, barely above a whisper, she said, "Good night, Dad." Nathaniel's throat closed, his vision blurred, and his hands shook as he squeezed her hand gently. He had waited 10 years to hear that word again. And now, finally, he had his daughter back. This story proves that love is never truly lost. What are your thoughts? Comment below and share your favorite moment. If this ending touched your heart, Leave a like to show your support for Nathaniel and Lily's journey. Subscribe for more emotional, powerful stories about family, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between loved ones. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in the power of love and the beauty of never giving up on family.